Welcome to Totally Awesome Films, and in this episode we're going to talk about the 1967 film Casino Royale. It has David Niven as a celibate James Bond who has no interest in women. It has Ursula Andress walking around an office wearing a circus outfit. It has Orson Welles sitting in a casino whose main character trait is that he does magic tricks. And it has Woody Allen playing James Bond's nephew Jimmy Bond, and he's the best thing in the movie. And it has lots and lots of beautiful, scantily clad women on screen at all times. It's a meandering 2-hour movie that has no plot and genuinely feels like it was made up as they were filming. Many cite the 1967 Casino Royale as being one of the worst Hollywood production histories of all time, and one of the worst movies of all time. And in this video, we're going to talk about the Trainwreck disaster of the 1967 Casino Royale and how such a movie ends up falling off its rails. It's an utterly fascinating story, much more fascinating than the movie itself. Now, I want to warn viewers not to confuse this for the 2006 Casino Royale with Daniel Craig, which remains one of my favorite James Bond films of all time, whereas this movie is bad. I mean, it's really bad. And you know what's really weird about this movie is when you watch it, you can't help wondering how such a movie gets made. Because there's a lot of superstars in this movie. Orson Welles, who was a living legend. You have David Niven. Peter Sellers, who was hot off his film Dr. Strangelove. You have Woody Allen. Ursula Andress, and it has a cameo by Peter O'Toole, who was hot off of Lawrence of Arabia. And it has a whole slew of other Hollywood A-listers. And right off the bat, you notice that this movie had 6 directors. Ken Hughes, John Huston, Joseph McGrath, Robert Parrish, Val Guest, and Richard Talmadge. And when you first watch this movie, it's very confusing. But when you see the backstory of this film, you begin to understand how this movie got made, and the backstory is very interesting. The story behind the film elucidates how this movie got made, and it's an utterly fascinating story. So is this movie the worst movie of all time? Because people think of films like Apocalypse Now, or The Island of Dr. Moreau, or Waterworld, and Casino Royale has also been compared to movies like Heaven's Gate or Cleopatra. But I feel those films were all watchable, and they all had a coherent plot. But the 1967 Casino Royale is completely unwatchable. It's a terrible movie. Now, on the other hand, there are also equally unwatchable terrible movies, like Plan 9 from Outer Space, Mano's The Hand of Fate, or Tommy Wiseau's The Room. But those were low-budget independent movies that more or less followed the singular vision of an inexperienced, untalented director. Casino Royale was a major Hollywood production with a $12 million budget. That's $113 million in today's money. And it had an experienced producer and had experienced directors who had all previously made great successful Hollywood films and would go on to make other successful Hollywood movies. And it also had an all-star cast of A-list celebrities. So it's difficult to think of a worse movie that had a higher budget and a professional and talented Hollywood crew. So if you base it on those criteria, this movie may arguably be the worst movie in the history of modern cinema. So it helps to think of this movie as having distinct chapters, with each chapter being an individual sketch comedy. So chapter 1 is the start of the movie, where you have Sir James Bond, 007, the legendary British spy who's retired and is visited by M, as well as a representative of the CIA, KGB, and of Deuxième Bureau. The 4 implore James Bond to come out of retirement and help them deal with Smersh. In case you were thinking, you know what would make a James Bond movie perfect? If James Bond had a lot of lions on his estate. Well, this movie has got you covered, because the start of this movie has an uncomfortable number of lions in it. Now, when Bond refuses to come out of retirement, M orders a mortar attack that destroys Bond's estate, but he himself is killed in the process. So Bond returns M's remains, which is a toupee, to his widow, Lady Fiona McTurry, at M's Scottish estate. However, the real Lady Fiona has been replaced by a Smersh agent named Agent Mimi. And the household has been replaced by beautiful women who all attempt to seduce Bond, but the women fail. And Mimi is so impressed with Bond that she helps him foil the Smersh plot. This first sketch was directed by John Huston. Chapter 2, which is the connecting story with David Niven and Ursula Andress. James Bond is made the head of MI6, and Bond is told that agents around the world are being killed by Smersh agents due to their inability to refuse women. To confuse Smersh and expose their master plan, Bond orders that all remaining MI6 agents be codenamed James Bond 007, then creates a rigorous program to train male agents to ignore women's advances. And these sequences were directed by Val Guest and was intended to provide a connecting thread between the disparate story elements. Chapter 3, the Mad Bond sequence with David Niven, was directed by Ken Hughes. So Bond goes to West Berlin to reconnect with his estranged daughter, Mata Bond, and the two infiltrate a Smersh training center, and Mata Bond uncovers a plan to sell compromising photographs of military leaders from the US, USSR, and China, and Great Britain at an auction, which turns out to be a money-raising scheme by Le Chiffre, played by Orson Welles. Mata Bond destroys the photos, leaving Le Chiffre desperate to raise money another way. Chapter 4 is the Peter Sellers, Ursula Andress, and Orson Welles scenes, and was directed by Joseph McGrath and Robert Parrish. James Bond hires Vesper Lynd, played by Ursula Andress, to recruit Baccarat expert Evelyn Tremble, played by Peter Sellers, whom she intends to use to beat Smerf agent Le Chiffre. Evelyn Tremble realizes that Le Chiffre is using infrared sunglasses to cheat, and Vesper steals the sunglasses, allowing Evelyn to beat him. Le Chiffre, desperate to win the money, tortures Evelyn. Vesper rescues Evelyn and then kills him, while Smersh agents kill Le Chiffre. This sketch with Peter Sellers, Ursula Andress, and Orson Welles was the actual original concept for the entire movie Casino Royale. This was the start of the movie, and these scenes were filmed first. And it does follow the events of Ian Fleming's novel, Casino Royale. However, Peter Sellers, who was going through personal and emotional problems, as well as letting the fame go to his head, fired director Joseph McGrath after 6 weeks into filming, who was replaced by Robert Parrish until Peter Sellers fired him only 2 weeks into filming. Peter Sellers then began to walk off the job and disappear for days holding up production, and eventually had to be fired himself from the movie. It was losing Peter Sellers that necessitated the creation of the rest of this confusing movie, and the whole drama of this is utterly captivating. And I'm going to tell you the whole crazy story of it all. And you might agree that Peter Sellers may have genuinely been losing his mind throughout the ordeal. Finally, the movie concludes with Chapter 5, where James Bond, the David Niven one, travels to London. Mata is kidnapped by Smersh in a giant flying saucer, and James and Moneypenny travel to Casino Royale to rescue her, and they discover this is a plan by the evil Dr. Noah, who is really Sir James's nephew, Jimmy Bond, played brilliantly by Woody Allen, and Jimmy plans to use biological warfare to make all the women beautiful and kill all the men over 4'6", leaving him the big man who attracts all the women. Jimmy is tricked into swallowing one of his atomic time pills, turning him into a walking time bomb. But the casino is overrun by secret agents, and a huge chaotic battle ensues. Jimmy Bond's atomic pill explodes, destroying Casino Royale and killing everyone inside, and Sir James and his agents appear in heaven while Jimmy descends into hell. Okay, that was a weird movie. And to understand the origins of the movie, you have to go all the way back to 1955 when Ian Fleming sold the rights to Casino Royale to producer Gregory Randolph for $6,000, equivalent to $70,000 when adjusted for inflation. And Gregory Randolph took the rights of Casino Royale and made the 1-hour TV episode of Climax, where James Bond is played by American Barry Levinson, with Peter Lorre as Le Chiffre. The project highly disappointed Ian Fleming, and he regretted selling the rights to his first novel. Well, Gregory Randolph then met with producers to try to get a big budget film of Casino Royale made, but in 1960, he passed away at the age of 67. And in 1960, his widow sold the rights for Casino Royale to Hollywood producer Charles K. Feldman. And making a James Bond movie became a passion project for the legendary producer. Feldman had already produced A Streetcar Named Desire with Marlon Brando and Vivien Leigh. He made Orson Welles' Macbeth. He produced A 7-Year Itch starring Marilyn Monroe. Charles K. Feldman was a big deal during the golden age of Hollywood. And in 1961, he heard rumors that two producers named Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman and their company Eon had acquired the rights to all the James Bond novels, except Casino Royale, and was planning on making a movie. So Charles K. Feldman went all out and hired legendary producer Howard Hawks to develop his James Bond movie, and even got Cary Grant interested in playing James Bond. Remember, Cary Grant was Eon's first choice to play Bond, but Grant could only commit to one film. Well, Eon was able to get Dr. No into the theaters, and it was a smash hit. And Howard Hawks, after seeing it, said he couldn't compete with Dr. No and dropped out of the project. Then Charles K. Feldman went to Eon and offered to co-produce a James Bond movie with them, which would be Casino Royale, and Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were very interested. Well, Charles K. Feldman insisted that he get 75% of the project and Eon only get 25%, so Eon walked away from the deal. Then Charles K. Feldman secretly met with Sean Connery behind Eon's back and asked if he wanted to be in his competing James Bond movie, and Sean Connery said he'd do it for $1 million. Feldman balked at this, but then a year later, he'd hire Peter Sellers for $1 million. And later, Charles K. Feldman said that he would have been way better off paying Sean Connery the $1 million. Without Sean Connery, Charles K. Feldman completely changed gears and decided to make James Bond into a spoof comedy. Now in retrospect, this sounds like an insane idea. However, it wasn't such a crazy idea at the time, because after the success of Goldfinger, the movie market was flooded with copycats of James Bond spy movies, and many of these were comedies that spoofed the spy genre. Also, the previous hit movie that Charles K. Feldman had produced in 1965 was the screwball comedy What's New Pussycat, and this movie was a hit. It was written by Woody Allen, who starred in that movie, alongside Peter Sellers, Ursula Andress, and Peter O'Toole. And by the time What's New Pussycat was completing its successful theater run, Charles K. Feldman was just starting pre-production on this movie. So a lot of it makes sense in that context. Woody Allen, who had just worked with Feldman on What's New Pussycat, agreed to be in Casino Royale, only agreed to write his own scenes and no others. Peter Sellers himself recommended that they try to get Orson Welles for the role of Le Chiffre, and Charles K. Feldman, who had produced Orson Welles' movie Macbeth and knew him well, was able to get him. So now already you have Peter Sellers, Orson Welles, and the actual Casino Royale property, and it was looking like they had a potential success. For director, Feldman hired Joseph McGrath, and Joseph McGrath was a Scottish film and television director, and he rose to prominence in the 1950s as one of the directors for The Goon Show, which was a comedy radio show that ran from 1951 to 1960, and it was the first major radio gig for a then unknown up-and-coming comic named Peter Sellers. Joseph McGrath then helped Richard Lester direct the Beatles' 1964 A Hard Day's Night and the 1965 Help. And his next major directing gig after the Beatles was directing Peter Sellers in this movie. Now keep in mind, when you hear all the crazy conflict between Peter Sellers and Joseph McGrath, keep in mind that they've been friends for over 17 years. Peter Sellers was born in Southsea, a suburb of Portsmouth, and was born Richard Henry Sellers, but his parents called him Peter as a nickname. In 1943, during World War II, he joined the Royal Air Force and wanted to be a pilot, but his poor eyesight prevented him, and he eventually joined the Royal Air Force's entertainment troupe, and even toured India and Burma entertaining the troops. After the war, he entered the theater, and then radio work for the BBC, and his first major work was on the BBC radio comedy series The Goon Show, which he created with his friends Spike Milligan and Harry Saccone, and directed by Joseph McGrath. During the 10-year run of The Goon Show, he also starred as a character actor in several movies, and then in 1962 got a prominent role in Stanley Kubrick's Lolita. And in 1963, he starred as Inspector Clouseau in Blake Edwards' film The Pink Panther, also starring David Niven. The Pink Panther was a huge hit and won Peter Sellers a Golden Globe nomination. Peter Sellers was then cast in the 1964 Stanley Kubrick film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, which earned him an Academy Award nomination and propelled him to superstar status. In 1964, he met actress Britt Eklund, and after 10 days of meeting, they married. Now, Britt Eklund would later go on to play Bond girl Mary Goodnight in The Man with the Golden Gun. Now, immediately after the marriage, Peter Sellers became jealous and paranoid and would freak out when she starred in scenes opposite attractive men. 2 months into their marriage, at the age of 39, during a night of intimacy with his wife, Peter Sellers inhaled amyl nitrite, which was reputed to stimulate the act. Well, it must have worked because Peter Sellers suffered a series of 8 heart attacks over the course of 3 hours. He would have to withdraw from his next acting gig due to his poor health, and incidentally, this would continue to plague him until his death by a heart attack 15 years later at the tragically young age of 54. In 1965, Peter Sellers and Britt Eklund gave birth to their daughter Victoria, but they began to have problems and were on the verge of divorce. Peter Sellers then starred in What's New Pussycat and then this film. So Charles K. Feldman already decided that they were going to make a funny spoof. Well, the problems on the set apparently started right away. So Peter Sellers was having problems with his wife, he had just had 8 heart attacks a few years back, and he was reportedly using heavy drugs and alcohol. It seems Peter Sellers was mentally cracking up. And one of the first problems the producers and the director had was that Peter Sellers, who is a funny-looking guy, he's funny. Well, he began to envision himself as a suave and dapper ladies' man and wanted to play James Bond as such. Peter Sellers was trying to transition himself into more dramatic roles and thought James Bond would be the perfect vehicle to do so. And he kept insisting that his lines be read dramatically and less humorously. And you can actually see him in some of those scenes in the movie where Peter Sellers is trying to be cool and suave like the real James Bond, and it doesn't really work because Peter Sellers is not a real handsome man. He's a funny-looking guy. Well, the second problem was that he would disappear for days at a time and hold up production. And this was because his wife was leaving him and he was flying to Sweden to try to convince Britt not to leave him. Incidentally, they did divorce shortly after the release of this movie. And without their main star, much of the cast and crew just sat around having fun and getting paid. And there was a lot of downtime thanks to Peter Sellers' absence, and Orson Welles just got drunk every day on champagne and threw parties with the cast and crew, whereas Woody Allen used all the downtime to hang out in his hotel room and wrote the entire screenplay to his first Hollywood movie. And that is totally awesome. Third, Peter Sellers appeared to be having, let's call them manic episodes, where he would come up with crazy ideas and force the production to go along. For example, in one instance, he had the idea for a 3-ring circus, and the production crew undressed Ursula Andress in a circus outfit, and even got an elephant for the scene. A real elephant. However, when it came time for the scene, Peter Sellers said that his mother came to him in a dream and said that it would be bad luck to film the elephant, and therefore he forbade the elephant from being filmed. Crazy stuff like that. And that's why we actually have a random scene in the movie where Ursula Andress is dressed like a circus performer for no apparent reason. The fourth problem was that Peter Sellers had conflicts with Orson Welles. Remember, it was Peter Sellers who got Orson Welles hired. Well, Orson Welles was already a superstar legend at this time and considered Peter Sellers sort of an amateur. Peter Sellers was upset and jealous that Orson Welles was not taking him seriously. And apparently, Princess Margaret visited the set. Princess Margaret was the actual cousin of Queen Elizabeth II, and Peter Sellers was apparently somehow distantly related to her. And they had met before, and he assumed that Princess Margaret would hobnob with him, giving him credibility with the cast and crew. Well, Princess Margaret, all she could do was go up to Orson Welles. She was a huge fan of Orson Welles and really wanted to meet him, get his autograph, and talk with him. And this continued to make Peter Sellers very jealous. Furthermore, Orson Welles was disgusted at Peter Sellers' lack of professionalism by disappearing for days at a time and felt that he was terrible for the business of acting. It escalated to the point where the two refused to be in the same scene together. So when you watch the movie, you will never see Peter Sellers and Orson Welles in the same frame because they were never on set together. So director Joseph McGrath tried to straighten Peter Sellers up because remember, they'd been friends for over 15 years and were friends before Peter Sellers got famous. Well, this resulted in a fist fight between the two. And then 6 weeks into filming, Peter Sellers fired director Joseph McGrath. Well, Peter Sellers didn't really have the power to fire Joe McGrath, so what likely happened was that Peter Sellers threatened to get Joe McGrath fired, and McGrath had just had enough and quit. Because apparently, Charles Feldman begged McGrath to come back, but McGrath refused. The next director was Robert Parrish, who lasted 2 weeks before Peter Sellers got him fired. And then Peter Sellers disappeared from the set again for days and did not come back. And he was out of town in Sweden, again, trying to convince his wife not to leave him. Well, this is enough. And Charles K. Feldman checked with his lawyers who agreed that Sellers could be fired, so Feldman fired him from the movie by telephone because Peter Sellers was in Sweden and apparently never returned back to the set. So now with only about a quarter of the movie filmed, they didn't have the lead actor. And I wonder if at this point, had producer Charles K. Feldman just decided to throw out all the scenes and start over, maybe they might have had more of a coherent movie, but they didn't want to waste the film footage of Peter Sellers and Orson Welles. So what they decided to do was to create a whole other movie to bookend the scenes with Peter Sellers. Charles Feldman had the idea to make James Bond a sketch comedy with several independent, loosely connected James Bond adventures, and the Peter Sellers and Orson Welles scenes would be one of those sketches. They hired David Niven to play James Bond for the bookend scenes and decided to make the movie with 4 separate comedy sketches. Now, the idea to cast David Niven as James Bond was an inspired idea, because apparently when Ian Fleming, after he wrote the book, when asked who he would want to play James Bond, he actually said that he thought David Niven would be the perfect actor to play Bond. So years later, after the death of Ian Fleming and 7 years after the film franchise, Ian Fleming's vision of David Niven being James Bond actually came true. Charles K. Feldman and the producers came out with a very weird plot contrivance to explain the uneven plot. And what they came up with was that David Niven was an older retired James Bond who's come out of retirement, and he decides to name all the agents in MI6 James Bond. However, it may be too generous to say that they came up with this idea as a plot contrivance, because this would imply that they really had a larger idea and a semblance of a script, and they really didn't. Because in many ways, there was no script, and anytime one was written, it'd be rewritten by the next day. So the crew really was making up scenes as they were filming, and this perfectly explains the chaos we see on screen. So if you think this movie looks like they were making things up as they were going along, they absolutely were. And for one of the segments, Charles K. Feldman approached his friend, Hollywood legend John Huston. John Huston was one of the prominent directors during the golden age of Hollywood and had directed The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of Sierra Madre, and The African Queen, among others. Well, John Huston had amassed some gambling debts and agreed to direct the movie in order to pay off those debts. And he agreed to direct the movie on 2 conditions. 1, that he had complete creative control over his sketch, and that 2, he got to film in Ireland. And so Charles Feldman agreed. Now, in that segment created by John Huston, James Bond is visited by his boss M to ask him to come out of retirement and save the world, but James Bond refuses. So M decides to destroy James Bond's mansion, but while destroying his mansion, he's killed in the explosion. And the only remnants of M is his toupee, which James Bond takes to his widow and daughters, but they've already been replaced by smeared doubles. And bizarre antics ensue, including a scene where Bond competes in a Scottish stone throwing contest, which incidentally goes on way too long. And of course, all the female smear agents fall in love with Bond and change sides. The next segment, Feldman hired Val Guest to direct, and his job was to create linking segments for the individual sketches. And Val Guest agreed to do it on the condition that he got to use David Niven as James Bond and Ursula Andress as Vesper Lynn, and Feldman agreed. In the Val Guest directed segments, James Bond returns to MI6, takes over as the new M, and then he decides that all agents of MI6 are going to be renamed James Bond in order to confuse Smersh. And they did this to explain why Peter Sellers is called James Bond at times. And they also created the character of Cooper to be another MI6 agent, and this was a way to functionally replace Peter Sellers in the overall story. However, this would presciently predict a later popular James Bond fan theory that all James Bonds, Sean Connery, George Lazenby, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and Daniel Craig are not one person, but rather different secret agents who simply use the code name James Bond on their missions. And many writers, including Alan Moore, played with this idea in his book, The Black Dossier. As Val Guest was directing, Charles K. Feldman was so pleased with Val Guest's work that he told him that he was upgrading his credit on the film to coordinating director. And Val Guest responded, "If you do that, I'll sue you. People will think that this movie was actually coordinated." And he thought that if people believed he coordinated this mess, he would never direct another movie in Hollywood again. So how did Woody Allen get roped into this movie? Well, he was a relative unknown at this point, and he was pretty much a stand-up comedian and was just starting to break into movies. And it was his appearance in the movie What's New Pussycat with Peter Sellers and produced by Charles K. Feldman, and Woody Allen was one of the first actors to be hired for the film back when this was a Peter Sellers movie. The next segment was directed by Ken Hughes and involved James Bond and Mada Bond. This involved James Bond going to West Berlin and meeting his estranged daughter, Mada Bond, who is his daughter from a fling he had with famed spy Mata Hari. The two expose a scheme by Le Chiffre to sell compromising pictures of world leaders. These scenes must have impressed Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman on some level, because the next project Ken Hughes would direct would be for them. His next job after this movie was directing the movie adaptation of Ian Fleming's book Chitty Chitty Bang Bang for Eon Productions. Now, the productions of this movie completely went off the rails, but everyone was having a great time, and you really do feel that it was one huge party. And every time a celebrity visited Feldman or visited the set, Feldman would say, "Put him in the movie." And that's how this movie got so many celebrities. Columbia Pictures had given Charles Feldman an original budget of $6 million. And as this movie was being filmed, the big business suits from Columbia Pictures came on set to complain about the production budget going way over. Feldman asked how much the film had gone over budget, and they told him the budget had already ballooned to $11 million. Incidentally, the final budget would clock in around $12 million. Well, reportedly, Charles K. Feldman took out his own checkbook and wrote the executives a check for $11 million. And people on the set said they never saw studio executives have such a quick change of heart and go from angry to subservient in a matter of seconds. Now, $12 million for a spoof parody movie? That's a lot of money considering that Thunderball, which was the most successful Bond movie ever, was made for $9 million. So you're making a parody of that for $12 million? Well, this movie does have one redeeming quality, one that actually elevates this movie, and that is the song, The Look of Love, written by Burt Bacharach and performed by Dusty Springfield. And this is an amazing piece of art, and Burt Bacharach said that it was the greatest song he had ever written. And it's a beautiful song and has been recorded by numerous other artists, including Andy Williams and Isaac Hayes. It was featured in the movie Catch Me If You Can and was the inspiration for Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery. And interestingly, Charles K. Feldman almost threw it out. His complaint is that the song wasn't funny. And after numerous arguments, he agreed to keep it in. And of course the song was a mega chart topper. It was even nominated for an Academy Award for Best Song, making Casino Royale an Academy Award nominee. And in 2008, the song was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. During the marketing of this movie was marketed as an actual James Bond movie, and they deliberately downplayed the spoof aspects of the film during press tours. And what really surprised me about this 1976 bad Casino Royale is that the film was a huge box office success. Not only did it make its money back, it made a lot of money in profit. And its final take was a whopping $42 million worldwide, which is over $420 million in today's money. And that is just crazy. When they asked Orson Welles, who just hated this movie, why this movie did so well, he said, "Well, you know it's pretty clever marketing featuring scantily clad women and bikinis." Well, a few years later, Peter Sellers called Joseph McGrath and apologized to him, and they met at a local restaurant where they repaired their fractured 18-year friendship. However, during the lunch, they ran into Charles K. Feldman, who didn't recognize Peter Sellers. And he told Joseph McGrath and Peter Sellers that he was sorry for the train wreck that was Casino Royale, and that he didn't blame either one of them, and only blamed that cursed jerk, Peter Sellers, who he felt single-handedly ruined the movie. And then he said goodbye to McGrath and looked at Peter Sellers and said, "You have a nice day, Mr. Allen," and walked away. And that's when they realized that Charles Feldman thought Peter Sellers was Woody Allen. Well, this video was kind of a weird divergence from the James Bond canon, but it's such an interesting story, I just couldn't pass it over. Now, in my next video, we're going to return to the James Bond Ian canon, and we're going to talk about the 5th James Bond movie, You Only Live Twice. This is the movie that made Sean Connery quit the role of James Bond. And if you enjoyed this video, check out some of my other videos on my channel, movies like Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, and Thunderball. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.